Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Want to welcome to the program Rob Larson, professor of economics at Tacoma Community College, author of Mastering the Universe, The Obscene Wealth of the Ruling Class, What They Do with Their Money, and Why You Should Hate Them Even More. Rob, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Sam. My pleasure.
Let's just start with, like you do in your book, with the sheer numbers. But also, I want to compare it to where we've been in the past, because I know, according to Thomas Piketty, we are the idea of some type of wealth equality, like the Great Compression that we had in the post-war era, is the exception to the rule. But where are we relative to, say, like the Gilded Age? Like, how bad is the wealth inequality, and how much money do our wealthy overlords have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the very short version of that is we've gone a long part of the way back to the Gilded Age. We haven't quite achieved the completely deranged numbers of that era. And of course, numbers from that era are a little spotty. It's before regular record keeping, of course. But thanks to the work of a lot of economists, not least Dr. Piketty, who you mentioned, we have some pretty good visibility on this now. So going with the US, for example, if we look at that just as a starting point, that classic wealthiest 1% of households, right now, the newest data that we have is those richest 1% of households owning 35% of the national wealth. Of course, that's a wealth rather than income. Wealth is always more concentrated than income, but that's pretty strong numbers. And if we look at, for example, other parts of the distribution, such as the bottom 50%, which is how Piketty frequently breaks out the ratios, we find that their share of the national wealth is about 1.5% compared to almost a third of the national wealth owned by that top 1%, which is completely bananas for wealth levels. But the Gilded Age, to the extent we have numbers, was a little bit crazier. The UK, for example, where we have better data from that era, we have numbers where that wealthiest 1% owned half the country, almost 50% of the wealth. So we've taken a lot of steps back toward the Gilded Age, thanks to the tax relief programs, primarily from the Reagan, Bush, and Trump administrations. So that Great Compression, as you referred to, is definitely in the rearview mirror. Incidentally, the numbers I rely on in the book for these questions of the numerical concentration of all this money, I mostly get it from the WID. That's the World Inequality Database. People should definitely take a look at their website. It's really fun, great data visualization. They have a separate page for almost every country in the world. Piketty is one of the economists who's in that consortium, but pretty ugly numbers regardless.
Do you have a sense of like the 0.1%? Because it just feels to me like we have, the fractal inequality, we have, it seems to me, more, I don't know what the equivalent would have been during the Gilded Age to the billionaires that we have today, but it seems like we have within that 1% also people who are literally in the stratosphere. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about the idea of space as you discussed in your book. But we have people living in the stratosphere, who are so powerful and so fundamentally disconnected from the planet, like humanity, that to me seems beyond where we were with the Gilded Age. Like in the Gilded Age, right? Like you got to take a train, right? There are certain things you have to do that you're literally grounded in ways that now you don't need to be, you don't have the same human constraints, it seems to me.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because, you had people who are definitely as egomaniacal as today's billionaires, but at the same time, and of course, going by purchasing power, the wealth of the big mega millionaires of the Gilded Age, like Rockefeller and Carnegie and the human J.P. Morgan, not the bank. It's comparable in its buying power to today's billionaires. Obviously, we've had inflation and so on since then, so it is comparable. But it is interesting because, after all, those earlier figures, though, it was the early Industrial Revolution. And yeah, as you said, you might have a fancier private train car, but you are still on the train. And it's still an era, before most antibiotics and stuff. So even your incredible oligarchs of that era, and their power was insane, don't get me wrong. But today, technology has come a century and a half further from where it was at that point. And it does affect the lived experience of some of these incredibly powerful oligarchs. And the disconnectedness you mentioned is something I like to talk about a lot. In the lifestyle chapter of the book, just looking at the daily reality for people with this kind of money. The disconnectedness, I think, comes from a couple aspects. I mean, just the first one is, remember, you look at families this wealthy, obviously you own your own home. You don't have a mortgage. You own your home and you own multiple grand homes. But you also have, not just like staff, but like household staff, people who are full-time working for you, cleaning your home, paying your bills, doing your errands. So you lose contact with that basic, going to market, the price of things. Everyone knows, the funny, Lucille Bluth meme. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. You got there first. The Lucille Bluth meme where she's wondering at the price of basic grocery commodities. So there's that piece of it. But the thing I always remind people of too is once you're in a wealth echelon of this level, you're going to have a bunch of people around you, paid or your friends, and they're all going to kiss your ass all the time. Because you're very wealthy and maybe also very powerful, and you don't want to get disinvited to the big yacht vacation or the white party or whatever fun social, heinous ruling class ice cream socials that you're going to. And what it means is everyone around you wants something from you. They tell you you're great. No one tells you you're an idiot. I always just tell my students, just think what that does to your ability to connect to reality. If no one tells you you're stupid for like a year, you will lose contact with reality. It makes sense. And when you look at the decisions these characters make, if you keep that context in mind of the crazy inner circle of ass-kissing sycophants, I think that helps you make sense of what they do sometimes.
Elon Musk, didn't Elon Musk just have a tweet where he put out like, it seemed, sometimes I can't tell what joke it was I don't remember what joke he told, but he said something in the tweet to the effect of like, sometimes the joke you tell around the table with everybody is not as funny as you think it is. And it's because they're all fake laughing at you because you're not funny and they're afraid of offending you in some way.
Yeah, exactly. I think, Musk really is a case unto himself for the just nakedly pitiful, desperate psychology a lot of these members of the ruling class. You can be powerful and still inwardly be just monumentally insecure. Just a fascinating case. People will be discussing his accidental self-revelations, I think, into the future. But that's a great example. Yeah, things don't do so good as they do around the table. Yeah, because we're not your employees and people who count on you for vacation time. That's right. Yeah, we're not cringing people who will say any heinous, like sub dad joke, non-pun is funny. Like that is the distinction there.
But what's interesting to me is how there's almost like another level for maybe the 1 and 10% even in this country of isolation that also I think adds a buffer for these extremely wealthy people. Like if you're in the top 10%, you also are now increasingly probably using services like Uber Eats or DoorDash or things that are your groceries getting delivered to your home, where those tasks are done by somebody who is a low-wage worker, maybe an immigrant who doesn't have documentation fully, or you're likely in suburbia. You're likely in your own little fiefdom in your, $800,000 a year house, or and you're reading true crime, or you're reading or listening to the local news about how dangerous the city that you're 30 to 40 minutes away from is. Like there's that other class beneath the very wealthy that I also think is experiencing a degree of isolation from community that only reinforces that strata above it.
Oh, absolutely. And this is like I mean, that's a major aspect of how these phenomena shake out. I have a little section in one of those chapters about class segregation. And this, unlike classic legally mandated Jim Crow racial segregation, this doesn't require any kind of ugly policy making like that. It just happens through natural market forces. You can't afford a house in the rich gated community enclaves, and just through natural market sorting, blue collar, white collar, and certainly with the wealthier households, they self-segregate whether they like it or not, really, just because of the reality of how these market forces work. So it's definitely something that we are seeing, though, with the the millionaire aspirants, with the white collar or PMC upper part of the middle class, who, as we all know, very commonly see themselves as being on the way to being Jeff Bezos next year. But that segregation, though, is important. And I mentioned this elsewhere in the book. If you look at marketing, pitching products to these wealthiest households, going back to those very wealthy ones, there is no word more commonly used in high-end marketing than exclusive. This is an exclusive resort and an exclusive event, and you'll take your private jet to a private resort where your private chef will serve you food in your private spa. The ability to segregate yourself from other people, and from wall to wall too, and even things we might like to avoid, like the big, crowd trying to board commercial flights. That's half the reason these people say they buy private planes, is so they can segregate themselves further from the unpleasantness of being a regular middle class person. But it's it's a completely decisive phenomenon, that segregation, for sure.
And that purchasing power. I mean, what's interesting is for instance, it will create a fake representation. I mean, you'll hear that the marketplace is democratic in some fashion, but the reality is that the number of people, for instance, who watch CNBC or watch Fox Business News is probably less in any given hour than actually watches this show over the course of 24 hours. I mean, we're just a YouTube show, but they are geared towards a very specific demographic of extremely wealthy people. And so the ad sales that they get there is not a function of the Nielsen ratings or whatever. However, it is a function of, it's okay if we only have 10,000 people, because what we're selling them on any given day is so expensive that the ad rates can afford to be higher. And it creates this sort of twisted notion of what's going on in the world on some level, that these outlets can be supported and be seen on the same sort of news sources and relevance, I guess, as ones that are supported by a much wider audience.
That absolutely is the case. One of the clearest places that you can see the class structure of our society is in our media. And I'm an economist, so I'm obliged to read the Wall Street Journal, which is, a very good newspaper. It's geared towards, investors and executives and, economists and managers and stock analysts and stuff like that. And the Wall Street Journal, is a very high circulation paper. But if you look at business media generally, very commonly, as you said, their audience numbers, it's not Sunday Night Football. It's not huge numbers. But in media, they actually refer to audiences that are wealthier as higher quality. In media, that is the term that's used. It's a very quality market that watches this show. And it's very high-end advertisements. But it's true. That means, though, in the same token, that a lot of this business coverage, which, every struggling small town paper will have a little stock section, or at least talk about recent stock movements. That's a huge part of online media, is catering to business news. It is relevant to a very, very small number of us. In fact, one of the, I think, most important points in my whole goofy book, and just an important thing for people to realize, is just to connect that corporate America and its incredible power of today, which we're all familiar with. We, as you said, we refer to the marketplace as being democratic, but it's one where you have only 2 or 3 options in most markets, just like politically. So maybe it's a good analogy. But if you look at the stocks that represent ownership of these companies, we often refer to corporate America and giant global firms as being unaccountable to the public. And that's true. They're not accountable to us. We cannot control them. If they want to outsource all of our industry after NAFTA's passage, they obviously had the power to do that, even though no American would ever vote for that. But they are accountable to somebody, and that is the ruling class through ownership of their stock, right? If you own shares in Microsoft or Walmart or whatever, you own a tiny piece of the company. So who owns the stock and therefore owns corporate America? Well, we have a little research on this too, not as much as we should, but the most recent data we got, just to kind of connect this, is that the wealthiest, again, 1% of households by wealth own 40% of all corporate stock. The 1% owns almost half of the entire corporate world, and the richest 10% owns 84%, like most of it. Like, that's important. Like, every time we see the incredible profitability of today's corporate empires, that money goes to someone. And if you're a middle-class person like me, and you were lucky enough to have a small retirement fund through your workplace, as I do here on campus, I indirectly own a few shares of mutual funds, which themselves own share in businesses. But less than half of U.S. households now own any stock at all, even those tiny holdings. So we should just realize when you see, that CNBC and other corporate business reporting, it's of relevance to someone. About 1 in 100 people. That is who it is relevant to.
And we should also say that 10% that owns 84%, between that, the delta between that 10% and the 1%, they're passive shareholders, basically paid off by that 1% who are running these corporations in a way that extracts the value out of workers, essentially, and communities. And they get acquiescence from that other, their fellow, the next, 2 through 10% by basically saying, like, your stock value is going up. We've done that because that's how we get paid directly. All our bonuses are tied to those stock values. And the way that we get that by cutting workers and by, in some instances, maybe if I'm like, I make airplanes, I cut some corners that maybe make society pay for the safety there, or whatnot. And that's what's going on there. Tell us about some of the most egregious, from a lifestyle perspective, some of the most egregious things. Because I knew a guy who worked for a billionaire. I remember him sitting down. He goes, he says, I know you think it's disgusting. It's worse. And in terms of, like, no, guy doesn't go through customs. Guy just picks up the phone, calls the president of some university. I didn't like what I read in this newspaper. And the president of the university jumps on the phone with this guy, that type of thing. I've had a conversation with a billionaire who's like, they were expecting a kid, and he didn't even know where they were going to have it. Like, it was more just like they float above the earth, and he knows it's going to happen, and he knows it's going to be the best. He just doesn't have to know the details of, like, where we're having that kid.
Yeah, the level of, like, freedom on that level, just like freedom from daily anxiety that we experience in the working and middle classes all the time. As soon as you get sick in America, it's, or get pregnant, will I be able to manage the medical care associated with this? Will the insurance company that belongs to wealthy people decide to pay my claim? So yeah, that is a big part of their lifestyle, is just this utter freedom that is pretty annoying, frankly, because, we all deserve a significant amount of freedom. I actually wrote a whole book about this years ago, Capitalism versus Freedom. People can take a look at that. But that freedom aspect is really annoying. But as to get to your question, Sam, about the lifestyle stuff, yeah, I have a large chapter on this because it's pretty goofy. There's a lot of stuff we can turn to. Real estate is always one that people want to talk about. 'Cause again, for working class people, like, your whole economic life revolves around your relationship to your primary residence. Can you make rent? Today's stratospheric rents. Landlords have lost their damn minds. Can you afford the rent? Or if you're a little more prosperous, Maybe you spend years saving up for a down payment on a modest home, and then you get a big mortgage that beats you up every month to sustain it, and that's if you're lucky like me and you're able to get one of those things. For the ruling class, it's completely different. So you have very nice homes that you own. They belong to you. You don't borrow money and get mortgages for things. You're rich. You're a creditor, not a debtor. You put money into the financial system that people like us try to borrow a little of to get a car or a house. So that's an important part of it. But the homes themselves are fairly insane. The best source on this, in my opinion, is in the Wall Street Journal. Every Friday, they have what they call the mansion section of the paper. And it's a separate section. They don't put it online, interestingly. It's just in the physical copy. So you have to be paying enough for an expensive Wall Street Journal subscription to see this thing. But it is very revealing. And I mean, there's a lot in the book. I just have a few examples that might be sort of representative. Just a couple months ago, they had a profile of a Hamptons property. And of course, people know the Hamptons, the Long Island kind of vacation area for Wall Street financiers outside New York City. They mentioned they were renovating. One of these families was renovating their giant home, and they had a bill of $30,000 for one room for the curtains. It's just I'm sure it's a very nice window treatment, but $30,000. I mean, that's
for the curtains only.
Yeah, just the curtains, just for the window treatment. I'm sure it's very lovely. But I mean, for most of us, that's like a car and a half. That's like a existential amount of money for like a middle-class person. Another one, they were looking at a very large Los Angeles estate. And this is just quoting them here to give you a flavor of it. They said the estate has 40 rooms, or 60 if you included the servants' quarters and the walk-in silver, fur, and wine vaults in the basement. That's interesting. And you have a lot of stuff related to the real estate too. That's kind of fun. Favorite story of mine that's in the book is a recounting of a 1950s socialite up on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, of course, where the old money is considered to be in that city. And it mentions the source I had mentions that this Manhattanite would send her butler back to Long Island, back to the Hamptons every week to dig up soil for her Pekingese peaches to poop on, because she preferred that soil, we're told. This is the kind of thing you can do if you have more money than you will miss if you waste it on things. And it's interesting stuff. I mean, the real estate we can go on with quite a bit. We mentioned somewhere else in the book that a number of more progressive jurisdictions like London and New York City have started requiring property developers, when they put up new residential buildings, they're mostly high end because that's where the most profitable sales are when you have a wealthy ruling class that's this loaded. But these jurisdictions started requiring developers, they required them to start having some affordable units, which are relatively affordable, way below market rate units. But the developers, forced to do this, accepted it, but they realized they didn't want working class people going and mingling with the high end tenants. So if you go into one of these buildings, there's a very beautiful entrance, and there's a doorman and a big glassy lobby with lots of light, and there's a concierge. But if you're living in one of those affordable units, you don't go through that door. Yeah, you go through the other door. And if you look at the photos of these, they're like utilitarian, off-white corridors, ugly fluorescent light. There's cameras and a sign saying, if you destroy property, we're videotaping you. And the term in the real estate industry for these separate entrances is poor doors. So if you live in one of these cities and you have an affordable unit, you will enter through the poor doors. I just remember this some write-up in The Guardian, if I recall correctly, and they were just talking to someone who's just a real estate agent. And she said that the two doors are so that the two social strata don't have to meet. That's the quote. It's like, this is the lifestyle. It's like segregation, and then there's the insane luxury on top of that.
Let's talk about what, I mean, aside from it being grotesque, what is the expense to society to have people who have this much money relative to the rest of us and the commensurate political power that comes with it I mean, these people are so, some of these people are so out of touch. I just remember, I still remember, like, even during the run up to the '08 election, a longtime fan of the program told me that she was at an event and Robert Rubin came and sat down next to her. It was for like a theater, and he was complaining about how much the traffic was, how trafficy it was, and that he had gotten on the phone in the back of his car and called the mayor's office to complain about the traffic. And she's like, where were you? And he's like, well, I don't know. Like, he didn't even know. He couldn't even tell the mayor's office where the traffic was because he's so uninvested in, he knows that he's going to be taken to where he's supposed to go. He doesn't need to even know in New York City, like, where he is at any given point. But aside from that, like, what is the cost associated in having people with such outsized power and wealth?
Yeah, well, there definitely are real costs. And that Rubin episode, like, is indicative of one of them. I mean, you have a ruling class that's just completely disconnected. And of course, if you're going to complain about traffic, it's best if you can do it in a story that indicates you weren't even driving in the traffic. Because, of course, you know, figure like former Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin and ex Citibank, if I recall correctly.
Yep.
Yeah, like a figure like that, like, he hasn't driven his own car outside of, you know, maybe his little estate buggy or something in many years, but he could still be annoyed by the traffic while he is chauffeured. Like, that is one of these things I didn't expect when I started this project years ago of researching these characters. Amazing how rich you can be and still make yourself miserable. And Musk, I mean, maybe exhibit A on that, but figures like this, like, how much wealth are you going to have to take and ruin in the course of ruining society before you'll finally be content? Yes, I'm driven everywhere. Oh, but it takes so long because other poor people are driving and it's inconveniencing me. So there's a cost with that. There's other costs as well, obviously. I mean, when you have this much wealth, just that much money locked up in these fortunes, you know, wealthy people, when they get more money, like from a Trump corporate tax cut, for example, in 2017, you're already rich. If middle-class people get more money, they spend it. Jimmy needs braces. Susie needs her college fund. I got credit card debt to pay off, my medical bills. Wealthy people don't do that. You own your property. You've got money. You invest that money. So one big feature of this new semi-Gilded Age we're in is we have all these bubbles in the market now all the time. And we had a big one break just last spring in March 2023 with those series of large regional, mostly tech catering banks like Signature and Key and New Republic Bank. Those all failed in the course of a large bubble unwinding. And of course, we had the huge one that crashed in 2008 that a lot of people enjoy forgetting about. Bubbles in cryptocurrency and stupid NFTs. I mean, in anything, clearly in real estate again, just because we have so much wealth locked up in those high pyramid levels of society, it goes pouring into blowing up bubbles in markets that then explode and the government has to try to bail us out of them. That money should be going to our climate transition and Medicare for all. Like, we have major needs. It would take a couple $10 billion to replace all the lead pipes in the United States, which mostly affect poor communities and disproportionately minority communities. That's how much money the ruling class is spending on its private jets every year. So, I mean, the opportunity cost, as we economists say, when you put resources into something, they're not available for something else. Every one of these guys' ruling class pastimes is money that could have gone to a policy of global social uplift that we really, really need. And to connect to that further, too, I could say I have a chapter in the book on climate-related issues, and we may want to talk about that. But the environmental footprint of these rich households is just breathtaking. So the costs are very extensive. And it's something that's it's hard to get media to focus on, of course, because, again, media are, with very important exceptions like this show, most media are commercial property. They're part of one or another corporate empire, or they belong directly to some billionaire like Twitter or the Washington Post. And so it's hard to get these realistic assessments of the cost of these oligarchs through when they control most of the information machine, of course.
And they fundamentally have outsized political power and can change. I mean, you know, one of the ones I harp on is sort of the Gates Foundation and the way they completely screwed up our education system for, going on decades now, just simply because the guy had the money and a whim, essentially. And then 10 years later, his own, the Rand Corporation had to tell him that, no, that was a huge mistake. We should have listened to teachers in the first place. I mean, how often does this happen? How often does it supplant things like, SpaceX being the is going to help rescue those astronauts in some way from Boeing's failures, and how much does Elon Musk's ability with all his billions to literally derail high-speed rail in parts of the country, or transportation, public transportation initiatives? I mean, this goes on and on and on. Or just in the news today, we're going to play a clip of Donald Trump saying the Adelsons have, told him move the embassy to Jerusalem, move, give us the Golan Heights. I mean,
yeah,
we could be in a war within a couple of weeks as a function of these things.
That is actually a great way of putting it. I didn't think about that, but yeah, the late Sheldon and Miriam Adelson's in stratospheric gambling wealth and their monomaniacal fixation on Israel and its territorial aggrandizement. You guys have had great coverage of Israel, Gaza, and as that now spirals into much larger wars, it looks like that's actually, you probably could not have a better instance of that. I mean, not that the Adelsons are the only thing driving U.S.-Israel policy, but specific crazy provocations. Yeah, above all, moving that embassy to Jerusalem, which just makes no sense for 50 reasons. But it makes sense for one big reason, and that's the checking account of Miriam Adelson. Though the power of these figures is pretty stunning. And Bill Gates, as you said, is a great instance of that. I talk about Gates quite a bit. I want to mention, though, the work of the heroic journalist Tim Schwab, who has a great book on the Gates Foundation, and especially how much it funds media, which is unbelievably extensive, and how very, very rarely media ever disclose that funding relationship, even when they're reporting on Gates or his foundation. I mean, NPR, The Guardian, most of the American national press take money in some form from the foundation or one of its, entities. And the disclosure, which is itself is completely inadequate. They shouldn't be taking this funding in general. But the disclosure sometimes only happens later when a journalist like Tim bothers them. But their power is incredible. And as you said, it's like watching private SpaceX supplanting NASA. They still get NASA's budget. It's just some right-wing corporate scumbag gets to decide what the policies will be. Watching, Bill Gates and many other billionaires. Ever since Carnegie, one of their biggest desires is to control the schools. And this part of the reason why Carnegie funded them was that it gave them a lot of influence over the public schools in the US of this era. But now public schools are too independent, apparently, for the ruling class. And so we have this huge, amazingly funded drive to get every politician from Trump to Obama to support charter schools, and where, again, it's public money paying for them. But we no longer control the curriculum and what is taught. That's decided by either the religious entity that funds the school or the billionaire that funds the school. And Gates and a number of others are really high on this. But it shows all of this, remember, is considered philanthropy, which is so offensive. Like a lot of ruling class, that is how the ruling class is justified now, is they use their money for good. And They do philanthropy, and they give money to, in Carnegie's era, it was endowing museums. With Rockefeller, it was always giving money to churches. These days, it's by having a giant foundation with your name on it, and you pay for ads so everyone knows about it, and you have insane money. So all kinds of very positive organizations that are funding starved in this austerity era we're living in, they need the money, but now you have to go through the gatekeepers that were hired by some mercurial billionaire. And you have figures like Michael Bloomberg who fund, anti-disease efforts and then get bored with them. Remember, the Bloomberg headline on that was Michael Bloomberg is bored with philanthropy. Great. I would like to point out to people the Gates Foundation. This is before its assets get split up gradually in the Melinda-Bill Gates divorce. Their personal problems really matter for us little proles because of how much capital is concentrated there. But that Gates Foundation has had a bigger budget than the whole World Health Organization, which is in charge of fighting Ebola and COVID and things like that you may have heard of. So like their stratospheric wealth concentration, it means less money for public services, and therefore their own right-wing entities, their ruling class property can step into that breach, not filling the need, but giving them more power over society. And I would just say it does work. If you look at just something as simple as the Wikipedia entry for Gates or Rockefeller or the like, it'll say businessman and philanthropist. That is what it will say.
Can you talk a little bit about the purposes of those foundations in terms of evading taxes? Like, I mean, that's primarily what they're for, but it also, I think, as you're saying, feeds the ego of some of these really wealthy people where they can dictate where their money is going as opposed to it more, broadly going to the public good via taxes.
Yeah, the tax evasion angle is a large part of it. And that's, of course, part of this huge effort. I mean, there are few things that the wealthy care about more than reducing their tax burden. They still want to use a disproportionate amount of public services, of course. They're the ones, remember, that own the corporate empires. And it's hard for Amazon to make money without roads that some public schmucks like us had to pay for them to deliver their products very quickly. Like these guys rely on the literate workforce that we pay to educate. So they want to vacuum up the public services with their giant corporate sprawling firms, but they don't want to pay for that. And that's why we have things like the Panama Papers that show us the unbelievable lengths that the wealth management consultant industry has worked out for the ruling class to hide their wealth from the ludicrous iniquities of the income tax. But foundations play a big role in that. They're tax exempt almost wall to wall, which means it's a way to indeed preserve your wealth and not just do all the power mongering that these philanthropies do that we were just talking about, but also to pass those resources on to their kids' generation. It'll be you'll be Junior's foundation soon, and he'll have those assets there, and he'll maintain that. It's that's pretty major. But also, you just mentioned, Emma, the ego aspect to this, which sometimes it's easy for us when we're looking at how problematic rich philanthropy is to miss that. The ego stroking aspect of this is monumental. There's a figure I refer to in the book. I forget his name just at this moment. I don't have it in front of me. But it's a figure who made a large fortune in the United States and started funding African NGOs to work on all of Africa's major social and economic problems. Most of them are caused by the colonial era and the debt trap that we've left them in. But putting all of that aside, he'll fund these things, and he's very open about it. I have a results-based philanthropy model because I'm way better than any philanthropist. My ego is even bigger than someone with white savior complex. I'm also fixing philanthropy, which is a broken model, I've decided. So they mentioned that he would give money to some, East or Central African NGO to build a school or to, dredge a river or the like, or dig a well. And if they did it, then they would get more money from him. And if they didn't, he would stop funding them. They're an underperforming unit in his corporation, and they're being punished. I'm withholding your bonuses, or in this case, I'm cutting off the money I was going to give you for these malaria mosquito nets or something. So it's pretty gross. But this figure who's so brave and proud of how he's disrupting charity, I just remember this specifically. He had a business card that had his name, Bob Donovan or something, Glimmer of Hope. That's what it says on his business card. That's worse than Mark Zuckerberg's "I'm CEO" bitch. This speaks to you could say it's egotistical, but I feel that really doesn't show you the crazy scale this can achieve when you actually are rich and powerful. The egomania behind this stuff. Again, you have to read their own words to really see the incredible scale of it.
So when we're faced with this type of, in my estimation, I mean, it's a fundamentally anti-democratic. It's a threat to democracy in my mind when someone this wealthy can decide what the health policy is for half the world based upon vaccines, or what the education policy is, or, what, can step in and lose 84% of the value of a social media company, but change the tenor of what reporters perceive as the sort of conventional wisdom amongst the people, as mustard. What tools do we have to even this playing field? I mean, to essentially prevent these people from hoarding this money and then accumulating this type of like political power.
Yeah, great. Well, tools exist. We do have them. The bad news, it's the same tools that the left, if you will, the people fighting for progressive policy or a more democratic society. It's the same tools we've always had. It's organizing regular people, to the extent that great compression happened in the first place. And we shouldn't exaggerate that, at the peak of the Great Society in the late 60s, like the richest 10%, their share of the national income never drops below 33%. Like it never goes below a third. So we never made them poor, just to put that in there. But the way that we did tax them very aggressively at that time, it was very real. And that is how we paid for the Golden Gate Bridge and the interstate system and the Hoover Dam and putting people on the moon. We paid for that by confiscatory taxation on really high incomes and fortunes. We got all that by having a giant labor movement. And so I think the first tool we have to look at is labor organization, just on that simple terms. Obviously, labor unions have been in pretty significant decline since union density peaked in 1953. These days, we're in the single digits if we look across the whole economy, which is a painful reality. But it's beautiful to say we are living in a labor, at least, renaissance right now. Hundreds of unionized Starbucks, even if few of them have contracts, like that itself is a significant step. The fact that we have one union in a Amazon Staten Island facility is itself an impressive achievement. If you talk to the people who organize those victories, it's incredibly impressive what they're able to achieve against the huge power of the boss to keep out unions. But bringing that back is a major thing. I mean, the labor movement is how people in the mass basis used to get brought. That's how they used to get brought into politics. And you see it in terms of a labor and dollars and cents lens. And I don't, why would I be mad about these migrants or this black coworker of mine through this culture war crap? That's just the wealthy trying to divide us. Like the labor movement was always what encouraged that class solidarity, like across racial lines. It's a very constructive thing, historically, the labor movement. Now, because the Democrats have, to a significant extent, turned their backs on labor, especially in the 90s, and with labor so weak, I mean, half the people who used to be in the New Deal coalition are now Trump voters because they're getting nothing from Democratic policy, very little over many administrations. So that bringing back that labor movement, and let me just say to the audience, like being in a labor union is a great feeling. It feels good to talk to your coworkers and take some steps that actually concretely improve your lives. It's not just positive for your economic standard of living, but it will make you feel less consumed with dread and modern anxiety if you can do that. I would say the other tool is to have a stronger political movement. And it's difficult, of course, in the United States with that. The parties control their state ballot lines. There's so much media concentration that's very difficult to build political movements independently. But with the Sanders campaigns and their surviving squad members who haven't been knocked off by AIPAC, those are very, very encouraging developments. I mean, people like us are old enough, Sam, that we can refer our listeners back to the Bush era, which is just completely airless, no left-wing national representation, labor completely on its knees. As bad as things are today, we have some fighting back happening. And with having good policy goals in mind, like Medicare for all, wealth tax, Green New Deal, these things have a lot of appeal. If we could ever get Democrats to run on them, that would probably be beneficial as well. But I think those fundamental tools are the ones we've always had and the ones that, offer us some hope for unseating this rotten ruling class we're saddled with.
Rob Larson, professor of economics at Tacoma Community College, author of Mastering the Universe, The Obscene Wealth of the Ruling Class, What They Do with Their Money, and Why You Should Hate Them Even More. We will put a link to that book at majority.fm as well as in the podcast and YouTube. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, guys. My pleasure.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.